Hello to all our listeners. We welcome you to yet another exciting episode of The Bigger Picture, EcoSpy's very own podcast series where we chat up with experts and renowned personalities in the field of economics about various social, political, and economic issues of importance. Despite progress, even today, India is widely skewed in favor of people belonging to the upper caste community. 30 years after the recommendations of the Mandal Commission and 75 years after the Indian Constitution mandated reservation for marginalized caste, caste inequality and caste-based reservation continue to remain contentious issue in Indian politics. Today on this podcast, hosted by myself, Akshit, and Ronit, we'll be speaking with our guest for today about the caste inequality prevalent in India and its relation to class and the political economy.
So, hi everyone. So, our guest for today is Mr. Anubhav Pratikant Singh. He is a Dalit activist and scholar based in Boston. He studied development economics at the Harvard Kennedy School and international relations at the Fletcher School, where he focused on South Asia and the Middle East. At the Fletcher School, he worked on the political economy of caste movements in India and taught a course on the post-colonial India. He is currently examining the trajectory of Dalit politics in the age of Hindutva. We thank you so much for joining us today, Anubhav.
Thank you, Ronit. Thank you, Akshit, for giving me this
Okay.
opportunity.
Yeah. Yes, sir. So starting with the first question, how did caste become what it is today? Could you please tell our listeners briefly about the origin of this occupation and status-based caste system in India?
Right. So, it's a kind of a difficult question regarding the origins of caste because different authors or people belonging to different schools have actually different views on it. And anthropologists and sociologists or social and even social historians have considered to be the most unique feature of Indian social organization as such. And we of course know the fourfold division of the Indian society, which was based on the Varna system around 1000 or 1500 BC, when the Aryan society was divided into Brahmins or priests, Kshatriyas or warriors, Vaishyas, and then who were the traders, and then there were the Shudras who was served these other higher groups, and then comes the Avarnas who were considered out of this fourfold Varna system. What we used to call, or even today call, untouchables. And this institution of untouchability sometimes arose between 13th and 6th century, and it came to constitute a fifth, a category known as Atishudras. But this Varna system was actually just a sort of a fundamental template to actually the real organization of Indian society, along which actually social ranks were conceptualized. And so more important for this social organization was the concept of jatis, that were vaguely referred as castes, borrowed from the Portuguese word casta. So they were occupational groups, and at any point of time there were around 3 to 4,000 occupational groups in India, which were held together by the rules of not allowing interdining, intra-jati marriages, and keeping the occupational structure intact as such. So different sociologists or anthropologists have studied this social stratification, and without going into this debate over nomenclature, we can identify different jatis or castes as occupational groups whose membership was determined by birth and whose exclusiveness was maintained by stringent rules of endogamy, and of course, commensality restrictions. And each and every caste was ascribed a ritual rank, which located its members in an elaborate hierarchy that encompassed the entire society. So someone, for instance, like Louis Dumas would say that this was a functional system and it was based on the rules of, purity and pollution. Yeah, and his analysis detached the system from its oppressive roots, to which someone like Ambedkar was very opposed to. And he thought of this system as a system of graded inequality, where the lowest most people, or the most oppressed, that is the Shudras and the Dalits, were at the most disadvantage compared to the other three varnas or castes which had the most privilege. Then there was also, as have been attempts at examining its material roots, where someone like, say, Gail Ombed would say that, it was, or rather continues to be, the remnant of a feudal system as such. So depending on which school you go to, you would find different theories of the origins of castes and how they actually came to function. But we can broadly agree on its characteristics, that it was held together by endogamy and, of course, restrictions on commensality.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that is a good answer to set the context for the rest of the conversation. So now, talking about how the situation is now, even in modern India, contrary to popular belief, some jobs still are sort of reserved for people from the Dalit Bahujan Adivasi community just because of their caste location. For example, domestic work in urban cities, or even manual scavenging, which is still practiced despite being banned. So, why do you think that still happens?
First, I would like to say is that, the system of caste as such has not been static. So people who say that it has been a static system and it has not undergone any change, I would say that is incorrect. The system of caste over a period of centuries has definitely evolved, and and accordingly, caste locations of different castes or jatis have also evolved in relation to other castes. However, when we come to talk about Dalits, and like you said that there are certain jobs which are still reserved from them. If we examine the distribution of wealth, that is, if we look at the material basis of caste, and if we were to examine the distribution of wealth in India, we would realize that the wealth overwhelmingly still continues to be concentrated in the hands of a few, and those happen to be most the upper caste. So if we were to talk about the poorest of the poor, or rather the most oppressed, there is definitely a sort of an intersection which happens between both caste as well as class. And on top of that, of course, is the system of pollution and purity, or rather the ritual basis of caste, which functions together with this material aspect of caste. So for someone's like, say, the Valmikis, or okay, right, sorry, right. So so people like Valmikis who are engaged in manual scavenging, it's hard to move up the caste ladder because, one, they are bogged down by not having access to material resources, and two, of course, it is the ritual aspect of caste also functioning, which has kept them where they are, despite almost 70 years of independence, and also having the reservation system. So that is also one aspect that we actually have to look at, that that even now, despite having reservations, the system has not functioned rather as it should have functioned, and that is something, of course, to be thinking about.
Yeah, that is so true. Yeah. So moving on to the next question. So people say that the caste-based reservation in India should be done away with because it comprises with merit. How would you respond to this anti-reservation narrative, which is very infamous among the general population?
See, when we talk about merit, and it's always amusing to me to think of merit as a sort of a neutral term. What do we understand by merit? The term merit is nothing but rather it is the sum total, or rather the product of all the social relations of any individual, including his or her material resources or aspects. I mean, it includes not only just access to economic resources, it includes mental health, it includes access to class networks, access to caste networks through which you can end up getting jobs, internships, or whatever, or move up the class ladder, or have an opportunity to what we call to live a good life. But if you are to look at the distribution of resources, is that distribution across society equitable? So would we say that merit as such is a neutral term. I mean, if someone were rich, for instance, and there was, in a competitive system like India, which is based on, how, not how well you have done, but rather, how well you have competed with people who you are competing against. It is a privilege to sit at home and prepare for a competitive exam, which, most cannot do so, right? So again, that's a privilege which your caste and class location gives you or provides you, right? Again, mental health. For someone who belongs to a lower caste, or someone who belongs to Dalit, or someone who's an Adivasi, or belongs to a backward caste, the mental aspect of caste, or the kind of discrimination that they've had to go through throughout their lives, it's been proven to have absolutely detrimental effects to mental health. And, it goes without saying that it, of course, has detrimental effects to your progress in any field. So, when we talk of merit, we have to take into account what its social and its economic aspects are. Then, continuing in the same vein, one of the reasons that, or rather one of the objections that people raise is, oh, it's only, the rich among the SCs and STs who are able to, who are able to avail the benefit of reservations, But a study was conducted by sociologists led by, I think it was Mr. Thorat, which examined, specifically this kind of narrative. And they examined the NSSO data across access to education and land. And what they found was that almost 96% of SCs and STs who were employed in the public sector did not have access to land more than an acre, and only about 4% had access to land more than about three acres. That is it. So, it is clear that the system of reservations has actually benefited those who are poorer amongst the SCs and STs. Secondly, studies by the likes of Jaffer have also shown that there is minimum class inequality, or rather wealth inequality, amongst SCs and STs as compared to so-called Savarnas or forward castes, where it is kind of maximum. Secondly, another aspect that, or narrative that we really come across is that that it is detrimental to efficiency. So as such, there is no word, or rather there is no definition which could actually define the word. But a study was conducted by Dr. Ashwini Deshpande and Weisskopf across employment in Indian Railways, and they conducted it across all four categories which hire people, that is A, B, C, and D. And what they found was very interesting, that that quotas had absolutely no effect on efficiency, one, and two, at places, officers who had been recruited through quota, or people who had been recruited through quota, actually proved to be more efficient than the so-called general category. And there can be varied reasons for this, that that they are motivated enough, they've gone, they are under pressure to prove themselves, or whatever. And of course, we may come across more studies on this later. I'm sure there are people who are working on it, but as of now, these are the 2 or 3 studies that we are familiar with, and all pointing to the fact that there is absolutely no detrimental effect of quotas on either efficiency or or dilution of merit. Third, people also tend to say that we could privatize, and privatization is actually based on merit. So and everyone would have a level playing field. Again, a study was conducted out by Thorat. I think this was Amit Thorat, not SS Thorat, if I'm not wrong. And so what they found was that there is widespread discrimination in hiring along caste lines, even in the private sector, and more so than the public sector, which has, a way more insidious effect on working hours, wages, and mental health. So, so this whole trope of merit and efficiency actually needs to be questioned and demolished. Yep.
Yeah, I think that was the most important answer for this podcast, because even especially among the students who will majorly be listening to this podcast, there's this general narrative of how merit is compromised, which I think comes from the lack of education and awareness about the caste issue. But
Yeah.
I think
So
you're explaining.
just a second, just to add to that, it's not actually a question of merit as such or people taking over your seats. The question is that there aren't enough seats as far as higher education in India is concerned.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you look at what has been happening recently, and if we talk of the government of India's neoliberal policy, we would find that in many central universities, they've now come up with self-finance courses, right? Now, who are the people who actually have access to these self-finance courses? I mean, of course, people who have access to resources, right? Or, in private colleges, you have management quotas. Right?
Yeah.
So the problem is actually a lack of seats, which is what people should be questioning about, right? Rather than questioning quotas or talking about merit.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I think that's something that should be questioned rather than focusing on reservation. So now I'd like to briefly ask you about what is the class and caste dichotomy, and if you could tell how these two intersect in the day-to-day life.
So I don't think ever in Indian history have there been two words backed by such ideological obsession as caste and class by their respective ideologues, and who have had so much effect on a nation's or any state's history. This fundamentally, there is actually no dichotomy which actually exists between caste and class. I mean, this actually is a very beaten question when it comes to, between Ambedkarites and Marxists. But if we were to talk about how this dichotomy actually emerged, this actually emerged as a result of a disagreement between Dr. Ambedkar and the Marxists of his time, who actually thought that, having been so steeped in dogmatic Marxist literature along Soviet lines, which almost had made Marxism deterministic, instead of dialectical, which, and just talking about the base superstructure model. And they thought, or rather they came up with the idea that, that caste was a part of the superstructure, and, and any change in material conditions would automatically annihilate caste and have a change in, because it would bring about a change in superstructure. They absolutely forgot that when Marx was talking about the base superstructure model, one, it was itself dialectical, and two, Marx himself did not pay really much attention, or rather did not emphasize on this model too much. And there was a time during their own life where even Engels, had to step in and say that, that this model was being used incorrectly. But Indian Marxists, who were primarily upper castes at that time and had absolutely little to no interactions with Dalits, and they were involved in the trade union movement, they chose to close their eyes to caste discrimination, because for them, any change in material conditions would automatically bring about a change in caste locations or bring about an annihilation of caste, which did not really happen. And this is what actually provoked Dr. Ambedkar, because because the emphasis was, because materialism was not just one aspect of caste, it also had ritualistic and religious dimensions, which the Marxists were absolutely not not focusing on. So that is where fundamentally the dichotomy emerges. And if you read what Dr. Ambedkar had to say about caste, he calls it an enclosed class. So his own analysis of caste vis-a-vis having a particular position with respect to the production process actually comes quite close to that of Lenin's conception of class, more so than what Indian Marxists themselves had thought at the time. And that is why, that both the processes of annihilation of caste and the class and, the battle for a classless society were one and the same, and they should have intertwined. But that is not what happened. And probably that may have cost India a revolution in around 1947.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was a wonderful answer to the question. Yeah, so my next question will be, can the caste system be annihilated under capitalism, or does the capitalism rather encourage it? This situation is important because there are people who think a good way to fight the caste system is for Bahujans to start occupying capital and resources, and not by following Marxism. So what do you think about it, Anubhav?
Again, we are once again venturing into the same dichotomy of caste and class. And like I just talked about, that it is the same battle, that for annihilation of caste and achieving a classless society are essentially comprises of having a casteless society as well. So, of course, I mean, if you look at the structure of capitalism, right, and the process of appropriation of the surplus, we would find that even if there were an emergence of Dalit capitalists, and which is based on the premise that more Dalit capitalists are going to help other Dalits and so on. But again, I mean, the process of appropriation of surplus, one, is going to remain the same for any capitalist. Two, a few people getting rich is not going to eradicate caste, because once again, the majority of the working class, or what Ambedkar himself called the depressed classes, which in his opinion also comprise the working class, is going to come from the very same Shudras, Ati Shudras, and Adivasis, right? So in a neoliberal setup or in a capitalistic setup with weakening labor laws, I see it almost impossible that the system of caste would be annihilated.
Yeah,
because it would just lead, in my opinion, it would just lead to more exploitation and the emergence of a class differences within caste, and just more exploitation of workers.
Absolutely. I think I totally agree with you. Now, I'd like to shift sort of to the topic of the caste-based census. So the last census, which recorded data on caste, was conducted in 1931 in India. But many people from the DBA community themselves feel that data regarding caste should be recorded by the government even today for effective policy interventions. So what do you think about this? And why do you think it's not happening today?
Well, I mean, of course, it is an absolute necessity for this census to happen, because, like I said, that if we look at the distribution of wealth in this country, it closely mirrors that of caste distribution as well. I think so. When we talk of the top 1%. Cornering 74% of the wealth generated in a particular year. I think it was last year or year before last. And, and India being one of the most unequal societies in the world, it is absolutely necessary to have a caste-based census to actually study what effects, post-neoliberal India's policies have had on those of the poorest of the poor, who actually come from, the most depressed classes or the most oppressed castes. One. Two is that it would prove rather why the government is so afraid of this is rather the of one, it becoming public that that there are more castes which are actually have been deprived by India's neoliberal policies than it recognizes.
Right.
One, so there may be a reason, and so there is absolutely, an essential reason to broaden India's reservation policies. One, two, it would also make it clear that it is mainly the upper castes who have benefited from India's neoliberal trajectory. And third is that, if we were to come across data or proof rather that there are more deprived castes and socially and educational backward castes in India than is recognized by the Indian Constitution, it would kind of deal a severe blow to the theory of RSS's, the RSS's theory of Hindu consolidation. And that is one of the main reasons why this census is not happening, because if you look at the last few elections, you would see that there has been a significant shift as far as the OBC votes are concerned towards the BJP.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about politics now, as we were just discussing. So my next question is, what do you think about India's political scenario right now? Like with the BJP strongly promoting Hindutva, and how will it affect the DBA community and anti-caste politics in India?
Well, it is kind of interesting and also sort of a paradoxical process that we have been seeing since 2014, and more so in 2017 vis-a-vis the UP elections and the last general elections in 2019. One is, of course, that discrimination has increased manifold. Caste violence has increased manifold. Incidences like Hathras and what happened in New Delhi with the rape and murder of a girl, of a young girl, have become commonplace. But what we have also been seeing is the shift of Dalit politics towards the right, particularly in 2017 vis-a-vis UP elections and in 2019, where the BJP hitherto was able to make inroads into what I label or call the non-dominant Dalit castes in the north, like leaving aside the Jatavs, for instance, we talk about the Pasis or non-dominant OBCs like Nishads. So that is something very interesting, and I think that it is more a function of it's a function of two things. One is, of course, the political patronage, with the emergence of the BSP and OBC parties like the RJD and the SP, the Samajwadi Party. For the first time, political parties realized that Dalits and the backwards could not be taken for granted. One, so almost everyone started paying them political attention, so that political and the most significant change came in the attitude of the BJP, where it started providing political patronage to parties, or rather non-dominant caste parties or parties and communities, which had sort of developed a sense of relative deprivation vis-a-vis the Yadavs in UP and Bihar and the Jatavs in amongst the Dalits in UP. One, so the newly emergent middle class of those castes have shifted towards the BJP, and thirdly, there has also been an emphasis on welfarism to the working class, or rather the lower classes or the deprived classes of these castes. So, which has also made them shift towards BJP. So, it is kind of interesting, but then there has also been some significant pushback as such with the emergence of some new parties, like, the Nishads have broken away from the BJP. Then you have someone like Chandrasekhar, who, and the Bhim army, who are leading their own sort of resistance movement against the BJP. So we are actually in quite interesting times, but we are definitely in a time which way Dalit politics shifts is going to decide the future of of the country.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that was a good overview of what's happening right now, even with the upcoming UP elections. So right now, one important question that I wanted to ask you is, so people often say that Marxism or socialism, these ideologies are utopian and unrealistic in the current world, or at least that's what capitalist propaganda tells us. How would you respond to that narrative?
Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it's a good question in a lot of ways, considering that we time and again come across such aphorisms from people. But I would say that this kind of propaganda is sort of just meant for the big bourgeois, and or the petty bourgeois, which happens to be the most vocal of classes, who are just below the ruling class, and they also happen to hold a sort of considerable sway over the working class, because a small group of large capitalists do not have mass support, right? So so such kind of propaganda, what it does is effectively it prevents the emergence of a class consciousness, so, and it prevents the emergence of a revolutionary proletariat, so, or rather the using of more active, or I would say militant methods of achieving a classless society, so, and the most aspirational classes are those of the propertied peasantry and the petty bourgeois. So, for instance, if you talk today to any engineer or MBA, they would almost, express almost a sort of unshakable faith in capitalism. Believe, where all of them admire Ambani, Adani, or Elon Musk. And they would have a firm belief in their own in their hard work and merit. But and everyone believes that the next great idea is going to come from them, which is going to rule the marketplace of ideas. But let's look at the reality that the propertied classes have absolute control over both the ideological and repressive state apparatuses, which ensures their hegemony. And it is almost impossible for non-propertied classes to get past this network of power and privilege. So the market is neither equitable nor fair, and monopolies have become dominant. So, so this is the kind of propaganda that we are, countering. But so, in an ideal world, everyone would have an equal status and an opportunity comparable to the sons and daughters of the big bourgeois. Any MBA or engineer could become an Ambani. But is that the case? An Ambani son is always going to be an Ambani. He's going to inherit that billions of dollars. But but the rest of us are just merely going to be cogs in the capitalist wheel. So that is why, if you look at what the Communist Manifesto talked about initially, they talked about of an inheritance tax to ensure equitable distribution of resources. Then a few years ago, there were, I think, massive retrenchments in the IT sector in India against the backdrop of weakening labor laws. And at that point, all engineers and all the believers in the efficiency of the market wanted the government to intervene on their behalf, because they were all leaving their jobs, or talking of something like, again, what the Communist Manifesto talks about, the universal public education. So we see today students protesting against student loans and grad unions, striking for a fair contract. Once even an 8-hour day for the working class was considered to be a utopia, but labor movements ensured that the workers got that 8 hours day. So, we celebrate that day as Labor's Day. So I would just say, that let's suppose you may not agree with Marx's methods, or you may not agree with his ideas, or you may not agree with the idea of a revolution, which is fair enough. But, I would just like to paraphrase what Eric Hobsbawm, the famous British historian, has, said, that if the solutions to the problems of the 21st century are to have a chance of success, then we must at least ask Marx's, questions, even if we don't accept his answers.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. And the ending was also like really nice. Okay, so moving on to the next question. After this podcast, if someone is looking to get deeper into left politics and looking to read more theory on it, what would be your advice to them?
First of all, I would, depending on, um, what your ideological bent is and where you're starting from, I would first advise you to start with the Communist Manifesto, of course, and there is a sort of a compendium which Marx wrote, it's called Principles of Communism. You could start with that, follow that with the Communist Manifesto, and then go ahead from there. I could advise you to read Lenin's What is to be Done, State and Revolution. But I would advise, more than theory. And of course, there is also Rosa Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin to be read. Two very famous women revolutionaries. But more than that, I would advise you to not get bogged down by theory too much, because more often than not, the problem with Indian Marxism has been that we've always tried to try and fit the facts within the theory somehow or the other, and that has caused the left movement quite a lot. It's okay to not have a dogmatic explanation for what you're witnessing, so it's more important to actually understand what is happening around you, and then go and read the theory and see what the theory says about it. And and if you find that it does not agree with what is really happening around you, discard the theory. That is what theory was. That is actually what the function of theory was. It has to be a very scientific process, like somewhat like Lenin or like Marx would do. Let's just understand that all of those people who we sort of choose to idealize or follow or admire, they were all products. Even Ambedkar, for example, they were all products of their time. A 21st century capitalism requires a 21st century lens to be looked at through. We do not need a 20th century lens to understand 21st century Marxism. 21st century capitalism. If we try to do that, we would always come up short.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. That was a great answer. So I believe that's all the questions that we have for you this time. Thank you so much, Anubhav, for such insightful answers. We truly hope that this motivates our listeners to understand more about the caste-based discrimination and how it manifests itself today. And I also hope that it radicalizes a few of our listeners.
Yeah, and absolutely. That brings us to the end of this podcast.
Thank you, Akshay, and thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for coming, Anubhav.
That brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you so much to all our listeners for tuning in. Don't forget to check out our Instagram and LinkedIn pages for exciting economics-related content, and we'll be back very soon with another episode of an enriching economic perspective from yet another brilliant mind. See you soon.